I don't have to add anything. It's just such a delight to be here. And one, to have a conversation with Angus. Anyway, it's my absolute pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to have a conversation with Angus. As you've heard, Angus has done an enormous amount of things, particularly in observation, but in a lot of other areas. And rather than me repeating the introduction, I'm going to hand over now to Angus. But the way that we are going to work this roughly is that I have a few questions, but I think there'll be very few because Angus is a fabulous storyteller. So can we perhaps start, Angus, with your childhood? Where did you grow up and what happened?
Could I just try without a microphone?
Yeah.
Can you hear at the back?
Yeah. You hear.
Yes, just. Can we do that?
We can do that.
Right. Thanks, Mila. I'm so relieved you got here. Yes, where I grew up was a village not far from Newcastle, and the first thing worth saying is the Second World War. During the Second World War, 39 to 45, I was at primary school. My father was away in the war. My mother seemed to have no objection to my roaming around through the fields and woods locally. And I remember on one occasion going into a woodland. I'd never been into before. It must have been spring, and coming across a glade ablaze with bluebells, and that image stayed with me actually. To use a classical phrase, I was gobsmacked, you know. And other wartime memories, there was an American GI camp quite near the village, and we children used to drift along to this camp and be given chocolate, which was unheard of during the war. So we did it often. And another main wartime memory was we used to get a bus to and from for lunch. Bus home for lunch, back to school. And one day, waiting at the bus stop for the bus to come, there was a low-flying bomber with smoke billowing from one of its engines. It was obviously a Lancaster or some other sort of heavy bomber returning from a bombing raid in Germany, had been hit and was desperate to land at Newcastle Airport. The airport obviously said no. It was a grass runway and too short. So the aircraft with smoke billowing kept circulating. The bus came, and I forgot about the aircraft. And then just as we were passing the airport, it flew low overhead and tried to land in a field, a couple of fields away from the road. It misjudged, hit trees, and exploded. And that was one of my most memorable but awful wartime memories, I suppose. And I was scared of airplanes for a long time. thereafter. I should have it at the back here in that.
Yeah.
Right, okay. The other relevant thing about the wartime was you couldn't go anywhere. My mother parked me with relatives who owned a farm near Hexham. So I spent all my summer holidays on a farm, which at the time included the land where the North and South Tyne meet. Waters meet, we sometimes call it now. We call it Halford. And one of my jobs on the farm as a child was to help to drive cattle down to Waters Meet to graze off the late summer vegetation. Now, we now know it as a prime botanical site, but obviously the cattle had done no harm to it, or very little harm. In effect, they were eating a meadow after the plants had ceased flowering and seeding. What else? Oh yes, I had a friend at school who collected 1-inch ordnance survey maps. And I copied him and began buying maps because you couldn't travel. The only way to experience other places was from maps. And that kind of got me hooked on maps. And it's relevant later. Do I just go on?
Please
Yeah.
do. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I believe you had a schoolmaster who
Well,
inspired you.
that was secondary school. Not there.
Comes later.
Yes. The year the war ended, which was 1939, was when we took what was then called the scholarship. Later it became the 11 plus. And I was too young to worry much about it, but I got to the grammar school, and in the grammar school we had a geography master who was inspiring, and he explained how patterns of vegetation on the global scale related to patterns of the distribution of the continents and ocean currents and wind vectors. And that notion of pattern, with my previous interest in maps, is very relevant to my later career. What's next thing?
Well, do you want to talk any more? Did you go on any field trips then? Or was that really difficult? Or did that come later when you went to university?
Oh yes, I remember a sixth form field trip to Monk's House. Some of you will know Monk's House. It's on the shore between Sea House and Bamborough. At the time, it was run as a small field centre by an ornithologist, Eric Enyon, who some of you may have come across. He was primarily a birder, but he was also good with plants. And it was he who got me interested in plants. And then came university, and the interest in maps and patterns made it almost inevitable I would opt for geography for my degree. And I specialised within geography in geomorphology and biogeography, and those two stayed with me, as it were, for the rest of my life. And as part of the geography degree, we had to do what was called a regional dissertation, which we simply go somewhere and describe everything about it. And I had quite a generous grant, which allowed me to go overseas. So I opted to go as far away as I could get by with the language, which was French. So I found myself in the Eastern Pyrenees, French Eastern Pyrenees, where, to my horror, they didn't speak French. They spoke Catalan. However, there were obviously people speaking, it was France, so people spoke French. And while I was there, I think it was a local schoolmaster who said, "You've got to get hold of a map, a vegetation map, which had recently been published." And he said, "You'll like it." It was published by a professor of botany at the University of Toulouse. So I got a bus along to Toulouse, went to a bookshop, found this map, which is here. And it's absolutely magnificent. I'll say a bit more about it later. So you can see where this is heading to: maps and patterns and vegetation maps.
Angus, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you just briefly, but this was round about in the mid-50s, wasn't it? How did you travel? Because you couldn't just jump on a Jet 2 flight and get down to wherever. How did you get there?
Train.
Got there by train.
Train.
Yeah.
Later journeys to France were hitchhiking, but this was train. Yes, I remember it was ferry across the Channel, train to the Gare du Nord in Paris. Our first night in a student hostel, and then I went out into Paris for the first time I've ever been there, and it happened to be Bastille Day. And Paris was lively, I must say. But yes, by train.
Yeah. So that, as you say, took several days to get down to the south of France.
Yeah.
So what did that then lead on to?
Well, a research degree. I mean, I was asked to stay on to do a PhD degree at Newcastle, although I think it was King's College still then, Newcastle. And because of all this background in maps, particularly Gotha's maps, and my interest in patterns and biogeography, my research degree was mapping vegetation in West Northumberland and the Scottish borders. And that occupied 3 years. I produced maps manuscript, perhaps. It involved days and days by myself tramping over remote moorlands. And there were times when I longed for a big grassy city, I may say. But eventually, I got my degree. What next? Well, the standard route, I suppose, would to try to get a job in a university. So I applied to various places. And the first place I actually applied to and was appointed happened to be Newcastle. It could be anywhere in the country. It happened to be Newcastle. And it was in the department that was then called the extramural department, which involved bringing university level courses to the general public. It changed its name numerous times. Education, continuing education,
Lifelong learning. No.
One thing I forgot to mention, when I was doing my research, PhD research, I had to get around. And that involved acquiring 125cc two-stroke BSA Bantam motorbike. And daringly, one summer, I decided to take it to Spain and back. We got to Madrid, the bike and me. We even got to Toledo, further south. And I avoided the Pyrenees by going around the eastern end of the Pyrenees. But coming back, I thought, we'll go over the Pyrenees. And the bike didn't like it. And it started, the engine started banging, knocking. Anyway, I staggered as far as the town of Bergerac in southwestern France. And it got worse and worse and worse. So I pulled into a garage, looked up Big End in my and explained to the garage owner I thought my big end had gone. And he listened and said, yes, oui. And I had visions then of abandoning the bike, going to Bordeaux to visit the British consul and begging the fare home, as it were. But the proprietor said, can you strip the bike down? And I could, I couldn't do it now, but I could then. So he said, I'll lend you a corner of the garage, you strip the bike down, I'll phone a contact in London and get the piece flown out for you, which he did. And it was so kind. That was one way. Right, where are we?
Well, so following your employment after your research degree, so you went into, well, what was adult education, I guess.
Yeah.
And you pursued that quite a long time.
Yeah, that is the department, the extramural department, as it then was, covered Northumberland, the north side of Tyneside, and Cumberland. So in my first year teaching, I was sent across to Workington, would you believe it, to run an evening course there. And I've never spoken to an audience before. I was so nervous, I hoped nobody would turn up. However, I got through it. And in the following years, I did lots of work in Cumbria, Keswick particularly, which gave me the chance to explore the Lake District. I was befriended by a man called the Reverend Canon Harvey, who was the founder of what was then the Lake District Naturalist Trust, is now the Cumbrian Wildlife Trust. And he showed me some of the botanical highlights of Cumberland, including Helvellyn, and the alpine plants on Helvellyn. And I've been up Helvellyn more times than I can count on my two hands. So yes, there were courses in Newcastle, Cumberland, various parts of Northumberland, but in the early 1960s, because I have a geomorphological background as well as a biological one, I started teaching my quaternary course, quaternary geology and biology, and I went on teaching that for 62 years. And it was hard work because obviously you can't repeat it. It happened to be a growing area in terms of research, research papers. So it's simply a question of keeping up with the state of knowledge.
And at that time, or maybe a little bit later, you were drawn into what became the Wildlife Trust.
Oh yes, the Northumberland Wildlife Trust was established in 1962. There was an inaugural meeting, what you might call a formation meeting, in this very building in 1961, which I went to, and that meeting resolved there should be a Northumberland and Durham Wildlife Trust. It was the Naturalist Trust, Northumberland and Durham Naturalist Trust. And so I joined from the beginning and was drafted onto the council very shortly. I was a friend of Tony Tynan, who was the long-term curator of this museum. So I got much involved with the Wildlife Trust over the years. Now, when I'd been doing my vegetation mapping in West Northumberland and Eastern Cumbria, I'd found a lot of very wet sphagnum bogs, which hadn't previously, apart from one or two, been known about. I had no idea then the importance of peatland as far as carbon dioxide sequestration was concerned, but I knew by reading Pearsall's New Naturalist, Mountains and Moorlands, which had just been published, how important a habitat it was. So having found these sites, knowing their scientific importance, I persuaded the Wildlife Trust to go to the Forest Commission and say, really, these should be nature reserves, or at least some of them. So I was asked to narrow down the number of sites to 8. And the Wildlife Trust went to the Forest Commission and said, we'd love to have these 8 sites as nature reserves, please. And the Forest Commission said, yes, provided you pay us a rent for the profit we will not make by not planting them. You couldn't imagine that now, but it happened then. So we coughed up a rent and paid it to the Forest Commission until the Forest Commission in about the 1980s changed their minds and decided to become a conservation organisation. And thereafter, the number of border mires, as we now call them, increased to 50 odd, and they're managed by the Forestry Commission, with the trust still involved, but nonetheless managed by the Forestry Commission. I coined the name border mires at some stage in this process. And the amount of money now spent on conserving the border mires, repairing them after they've been drained around the margin, for example, is over £2 million of public money, one way or another.
Now there's a story I seem to remember about the native Scots pine as well.
Yeah. When I was doing my research fieldwork, the Forestry Commission employed a surveyor who was of Latvian origin. He was a displaced person during the war, called Blankenbergs. And I got to know him. He was very helpful, in fact. And he was something of a polymath, apart from being a surveyor. He was interested in plants. And during his spare time, he walked up all the burns and sykes in the Keeler Forest area, noting the trees and shrubs growing along. And in one of these sideburns of the major rivers, Williams Clough, in the Keeler Head area, he discovered a group of Scots pine. They're now referred to as the Williams Clough Scots pines. And from the beginning, there was a thought they may well be native, in which case they'd be the only native Scots pines south of the Scottish Highlands. And over the years, the debate continued as to whether or not they were native, but increasingly evidence, the genetic evidence is building up that they are. And assuming that is the case, the Wildlife Trust persuaded the Forestry Commission to use seeds to create a new wildwood on the other side of the Scap Burn, of which Williamstown is a tributary, and that was called the Keeler Head Wildwood, which is based upon the allegedly native pines.
So not only were you involved in conservation, but I believe you were a politician for a while as well. We'd never believe this.
All right. I live in Edinburgh. I'd lived there for quite a while, and we never had a local election. We were in one of the 6 districts that Northumberland then consisted of, Castle Morpeth, and we had an unelected councillor, so I won't say what party. I thought there should be an election, so I put my name forward with no intention of getting elected. But when you put your name forward, people start helping you. So you've got to start trying. So I got elected to Castlemore Council with no knowledge whatsoever of how local government worked. I had vague ideas that with my ecological conservation background, I might be able to do something useful about local nature reserves or not building on floodplains or sensible things like that. But when you're a new councillor, you can't achieve anything very much. However, as the years go by, and I was a councillor for 21 years, would you believe, I got more savvy about how the system works. And I became chairman of the planning committee, and then chairman of the finance committee, which meant that I had to represent the council at national meetings of local authorities. So I've got to places I've never been to before, like Bournemouth and Blackpool and Scarborough, and such conference centres. And as to what I achieved, well, for my own village, I certainly achieved allotments, which there hasn't been before, and a local nature reserve. But I found it endlessly interesting. That's why I went on for so long. It was fascinating how another way of life works. You know?
And that kind of links quite nicely to the work that you did with the national parks, Northumberland and UK, with the Council for National Parks.
Yes, some of you will remember Trevor Hardy, who died quite recently. He was a Secretary of State member of the Northumberland National Park Committee, and when he retired, he somehow contrived to put my name forward to be a member of the Northumberland National Park Committee, which I was for a number of years. Now, there is a body called the Council for National Parks, which was set up to lobby that there should be national parks in the 1930s. Having achieved national parks in the 1949 Act, it remained as a lobbying group to keep the new national parks on their toes, as it were. Trevor Hardy had been the Northumberland rep on the Council for National Parks. When he retired, he put forward my name, and I became the Northumberland rep on the Council for National Parks, which meets in London. It sort of involved numerous trips to London, which you can always combine with doing something useful, like visiting museums or art galleries. And I eventually became the chairman of the Council for National Parks, which involved trips to all the country's national parks. And apart from chairman, there was a president, a sort of public voice. And two presidents, I remember, were Chris Bonington. And I boast that I once went climbing with Chris Bonington. We were visiting Snowdonia, and he saw a rock face, and he started scrambling up it. And I scrambled up behind him for at least 3 feet off the ground. And another president we had was the actor Brian Blessed. Some of you may remember. In life, he was exactly as an actor. And on one occasion, we were visiting the Northwood Moors National Park, and we went up to the communications mast at Fallingdales on the Northwood Moors. And the police got very suspicious of what this gang was doing around this NATO satellites, whatever site. And the police came roaring up. And when they saw Brian Blessed, who'd just been playing a policeman, they got themselves photographed with him.
Yeah, and I believe that you were, or are still, a very keen supporter of Newcastle United. Is that right?
Right, it's an important weekend. My grandfather's brother was chairman of Newcastle United in the 1930s. He actually saw them win the FA Cup. He also got them relegated to the old second division. That made my father interested. And he bought me a child's season ticket. And on many a Saturday, I would be playing football for the school in the morning and going to St James's Park in the afternoon. And I went on supporting the club until I started playing football on Saturday afternoons. And then there was a family to bring up and lots of work, and I gave up going until, it must have been 1980s, I think. And I started going again and been going ever since.
Well, I was just thinking that there are other connections here with Northumberland that you talked about. So you also mentioned Cumbria as a connection. Was that mainly through the border wires that you...
Well, the Cumbria connection mainly comes from my wife, my late wife, who was born and brought up in Alston. And when her parents became too old to manage the house, which is really out in the sticks, Jean's father was very anxious that it stayed in the family. So we got an estate agent to negotiate a family price, as it were, so we could acquire the house. And we did. And then a few years later, the farm it was sitting in the middle of was too small to make a living, and the farm was broken up, and the bits were sold off. So we decided to buy the fields adjacent to the house and also a wood. And we've managed the fields as a meadow ever since. We became farmers in the sense of registering with MAF. We have applied for and received funding under various agri-environmental schemes, and fields that were wonderful upland flower-rich meadows when my wife was a child have been just grazed for a number of years, but not sufficiently hard just destroy the meadow flora. So we were able, by restricting grazing to late summer, to restore the meadow vegetation. And now they're rather nice flower-rich meadows again. Trolleys, for example. Clover.
I just realised, and this is really jumping badly, but one thing I've completely forgotten to ask you about is your book. Because you have written a very important book.
Well, one day I simply got a phone call out of the blue from Derek Ratcliffe, who some of you may know. He was a senior editor of the New Naturalist series, and he said, would I consider writing a new naturalist book on Northumberland and Durham? I said, I don't know anything about County Durham. So we settled on Northumberland with Alston Moor because of my Alston connections. So I had to write some test chapters, as it were, just to prove I could write, as it were. In the end, I was told to get on with it, and it's happened.
How long did it take you to write that?
Off and on for several years, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very substantial. I mean, I recently started rereading bits of it, and it's huge. It still stands as an incredibly important piece of work about Northumberland. Right. Well, I know we're kind of reaching the end, but I know everybody has been really waiting for the chicken story. The chicken shack story.
Right. As I said, the extramural department covered Cumberland. And we ran field courses at various venues. And we were always looking for a new venue. And the old Cumberland County Council had recently acquired a house on the shores of Derwentwater called Hawes End, H-A-W-S-E, Hawes End. And I went across to suss it out, as it were, and wasn't awfully convinced it was a good place to have courses. But nonetheless, the just newly appointed warden said, you might be interested in the shed in the grounds. There seem to be some documents buried under chicken excrement. He didn't use that word. And I had my wife, Jean, with me, who was a librarian. So we went in, and sure enough, in this wooden shed was a floor covered with chicken excrement, but poking through it were bits of paper. So we excavated it. And it wasn't just bits of paper, it was a whole library. The house had been used as a convalescent home during the war. The books from the library obviously been chucked into the shed, and then someone else, stupidly, had used it as a chicken shed. So anyway, we began digging around and realized it was very precious indeed. I mean, the books included books by Darwin, for example. So we told the warden that was important. And we had a friend, Chris Hunt, some of you may know, who was the deputy librarian at Newcastle University. So we took him across and did some more excavation. And, well, what did we find? We found a suffragette banner, would you believe, because the daughter of the owner of the house was a very prominent suffragette. And the correspondence showed that she, Catherine Marshall, was into every good left-wing cause you could think of. And there were letters to the Prime Minister, letters to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to and from. It was really a gold mine. And then the books, as I say, several Darwin books, Alfred Russel Wallace, the book that I presented to the Natural History Society, Kroll, Climate and Time, which was the inkling that glaciations had been caused by wobbles in the Earth's orbit. So a deal was done. Cumbria would have the local stuff. Newcastle would have the literary stuff. The scientific stuff would be halved. And Jean, my wife, and I, for our trouble, could have half a dozen books of our choice. So I chose the Wallace book, a couple of Darwin's, and one or two others. So that's the story of the chicken shed.
Is there any, I mean, Angus, you've had such a rich life and you have been involved in so many fascinating aspects of life in Northumberland. Is there anything, well, here are my notes, anything that you would like to add? We'll take some questions, and we have a question already.
I was on the council of the Northumberland Wildlife Trust, and every year it came to a point when we had to decide the date of the AGM. And everyone would get out their diaries, and then somebody would say, well, what about this date? And I was saying, no. And everyone would look at it and say, why?
Sorry, question.
Sorry. Well, it's again a story against you, Angus. We'd all say, why? And he'd say, well, it's the date of the cup final. Now, these were the days when, because I had absolutely no chance of anywhere near them when. But if you want to go to that, one thing we haven't learned is courage play.
Thank you so much, Angus and Mima. I must admit, I just think we are in such a wonderful, joyous position here. You know, NHSN's home is very much at the Hancock. I think I know most people in this room. In case you don't know, I'm Claire Freeman, I'm Director of NHSN. I just get the absolute joy and privilege of meeting so many people. And I know when I started a number of years ago and people introduced me to Angus and the amount of stories and history that there is here. And, you know, upstairs we've got a wonderful North East Nature Archive. And we talk about the treasures of the archive. And Mel and the volunteers put some of those treasures out there tonight. But, you know, it's like some of the inspiration for our Talking Naturally series of interviews on YouTube's and evenings like tonight is the fact that people are also very much today's treasures. And this is all about kind of sharing some of those stories. And I must admit, it's just absolutely inspirational. And I think, you know, we talk about kind of we're here to inspire wonder in the natural world, we're here to protect it, you know, so that other people can enjoy it as well. And I must admit, I mean, it has been truly inspiring. I must admit, I did just chat to Angus earlier on this afternoon, because this morning we were talking to some colleagues from a regional and national organisation. And one of them just happened as they came out of our bird hide at Gosforth to say, you know, is Angus still involved with NHSN? And I said, well, funnily enough, in actual fact, tonight, I'm looking forward to having an evening at the Hancock. And this chap, he very went kind of misty-eyed, and he said, I've got a lot to thank Angus for. And he said, I've been in my job at this organisation for 34 years. And he said, it was thanks to Angus, actually, he helped me get a grant, that then I was able to go to college. And he said, if it wasn't for that, he said, I would never have had this amazing career, you know, working in conservation and heritage. And I just think there must be so many layers and layers of achievements that we just haven't even been able to touch on tonight as well. So I just have a small gesture of appreciation, because please don't drop it as they hit there, Angus. It will break. So just again, please put your hands together for the